You fix this? Don't make me laugh. You people can barely change a tire. The manager's voice was sharp enough to cut through steel. His laughter rolled across the dealership's service bay like a toxic cloud, forcing every tool, every movement, every conversation to stop cold. That was the moment, the exact second, when a black mechanic named Darnell was told to his face that he wasn't good enough. Not smart enough, not worthy enough to touch the most complicated engine anyone in that shop had ever seen. But what happened in the minutes that followed would shake the entire dealership, ruin reputations, and remind everyone watching that dignity speaks louder than cruelty. The dealership was too clean for its own good. Up front, where the customers walked in through the double glass doors, everything gleamed. The polished tile floors, the coffee station with spotless mugs, the salespeople with their plastered-on smiles. But behind the glass partition, in the service bay where the real work happened, life was different. The smell of hot oil clung to the air, heavy and sour. Coolant dripped somewhere in the distance, a faint hiss escaping from a radiator. Fluorescent lights buzzed like angry hornets, their glare bouncing off half-finished repairs. The floor bore scars of its own history, dark stains from years of grease, skid marks from tires, dents from tools dropped in anger or exhaustion. Usually it was noisy back there, pneumatic wrenches clattering, engines revving, men shouting over the roar of machinery. But when Richard Kane spoke, the noise collapsed into silence. Richard had that effect on people, not because he was respected, but because he was dangerous, tall and broad-shouldered, with slick hair that glistened under the lights. Richard always dressed like he was headed to a corporate dinner. His shirts were crisp, his ties loud, his loafers shiny enough to see your face in. To customers, he was all charm. Firm handshakes, confident promises, the kind of salesman grin that looked good in glossy brochures. But the second he stepped into the service bay, the mask dropped. His charm turned to venom, his smiles into sneers. Here Richard reigned with insults, favoritism and humiliation, and today he had chosen his target. Darnell. Darnell was the opposite of Richard in every way. Where Richard performed, Darnell endured. Where Richard shouted, Darnell listened. He wasn't flashy. He didn't need to be. His work spoke louder than his words ever could. He stood there now in navy blue coveralls streaked with grease, a rag hanging from his pocket, his scarred hands still dirty from the brake job he'd just finished. His shoulders were squared, his gaze steady, his silence unshakable. But Richard thrived on breaking silence. "You really think this guy can handle it?" Richard jeered, sweeping his hand toward the car that had been dragged in earlier that morning. His voice was raised just enough to make sure everyone in the bay could hear. "This isn't some backyard junker from a scrapyard. This is a six-figure machine, built for people who actually matter, and you're telling me he's the one to fix it?" The circle of mechanics standing nearby shifted uncomfortably. Some of the younger ones looked down at their boots, shame flickering across their faces. They admired Darnell. They'd seen him pull off repairs others swore couldn't be done. But speaking up against Richard? That was suicide. The man controlled the schedule. He decided who got overtime, who got cut. Defy him, and you might find yourself with half the hours you needed to pay rent. A couple of Richard's favorites snickered, eager to show their loyalty. Their laughter bounced off the walls, forced and brittle. Darnell said nothing. He just looked at the engine, not like a man intimidated, but like a man listening. And that silence made Richard furious. What, no comeback? Richard pressed, pacing in front of him. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you don't have one. Don't tell me you're scared to get your hands dirty. Oh, wait." His smirk widened as he gestured to the grease stains on Darnell's coveralls. "They already are, aren't they?" The laughter came again, sharper this time, cutting through the bay like knives. The engine itself sat like a beast between them, a V12 luxury import, its hood gaping open, its guts exposed. Wires tangled like veins, valves glinted like bone, and the diagnostic computer on the side blinked angrily with error codes that didn't make sense. It wasn't just broken. It was a puzzle designed to mock anyone who dared to solve it. The wealthy owner had dropped it off himself, storming into Richard's office in a suit that probably cost more than the mechanics made in a month. His gold Rolex caught the light as he slammed his keys on the desk. Your best man, he demanded. I don't care what it costs. Just fix it. Richard had nodded, smiling, promising results. But the second the hood was lifted and the scale of the problem revealed, Richard's confidence cracked. The only way to protect himself was to shove someone else into the fire, and Darnell was the perfect scapegoat. Richard's voice echoed across the bay again. Come on then, Darnell. Show us all your magic tricks. Or, he leaned in close enough for only the nearest few to hear. Admit you're out of your depth and I'll get someone qualified to handle this. He dragged the word qualified like a blade. The silence that followed wasn't ordinary. It was heavy, charged, almost electric. Even the air compressor in the corner seemed to hold its breath. One of the younger mechanics, Jason, shifted uncomfortably. His jaw tightened as he looked at Darnell. Jason had only been at the dealership a year, but he'd already learned more from watching Darnell than from any manual. He wanted to speak, to say something, but fear kept him frozen. Another tech, Miguel, glanced at Richard and then back at the car. He'd been around long enough to know how this game worked. Darnell wasn't being asked to succeed. He was being set up to fail, but Darnell reached into his pocket, pulled out the rag, and wiped his hands slowly, deliberately. He folded it neatly, placed it on the workbench, and stepped toward the engine. His eyes didn't leave the maze of wires and valves. He didn't answer Richard. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any argument. Richard smirked, mistaking silence for surrender. But the others, the ones watching closely, saw something different. They saw the shift in Darnell's posture, the steadiness in his gaze, the quiet focus of a man who had walked this road before. The impossible engine loomed like a mountain no one dared to climb, and Darnell was already taking his first step. Mini cliffhanger. End of part 1. The rag lay folded on the bench. The shop was silent, every eye locked on Darnell as he leaned over the impossible engine, his hands steady, his mind already at work. No one in that room, not even Richard, had any idea what was about to happen next. The silence in the bay stretched long enough to make the buzzing fluorescence sound like a swarm of bees. Darnell stepped forward slowly, as though the air between him and that V-12 was thicker than normal. His boots echoed on the concrete floor, the kind of hollow sound that makes men stop breathing for a second. Richard leaned back against the hood of a nearby sedan, arms crossed, smirk plastered across his face. Go ahead, he said, loud enough for the entire shop. Show us what decades of shade tree training taught you. Maybe we'll all learn how to fix a luxury car with duct tape and prayer. The chuckles that followed weren't hearty. They were nervous. Mechanics shifted uncomfortably in their steel-toed boots. Everyone knew Richard wanted a show, not a fix. Darnell ignored him. He pulled a rag from his pocket, wiped his hands once, then laid them on the edge of the engine bay, like a man laying hands on a wounded animal. He didn't speak. He just listened. The engine wasn't running, but it was alive. He could smell the faint burn of fuel not combusted properly. He could see the tremor in the way one wire's insulation had bubbled slightly, like it had overheated in a way no scan tool would ever pick up. He leaned closer, fingertips brushing wires, sensors, casing. Behind him, Richard's voice dripped mockery. Careful now. Wouldn't want you to break something expensive. Lord knows how long it would take you to pay off that mistake on your salary. Darnell's jaw flexed. He wanted to answer, but he'd learned long ago that some words don't need to be spoken. They need to be proven. A young tech named Miguel stood off to the side, watching with wide eyes. He whispered to another, "He's not even looking at the scanner." "Who does that?" The other shrugged, glancing nervously at Richard. "Dead man walking." Richard caught the whispers and grinned, turning them into fuel for his cruelty. "That's right," he said, voice booming. "No scanner, no fancy training, no European certification, just instinct." He drawled the word like it was dirt in his mouth. "That's what you're betting on? Instinct?" Darnell finally spoke, his voice calm and even. "Engines talk. You just have to know how to listen." The sentence landed like a stone in water. Ripples spread through the watching crowd. Some mechanics smirked. Others swallowed hard. Richard scoffed. But for the first time, his eyes narrowed, just a fraction. Darnell grabbed a tool, not the advanced diagnostic unit, not the shiny new torque gun. Just a plain old flashlight. He leaned deep, clicking it on, letting the beam crawl over the mechanical jungle. His hand was steady, deliberate. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't performing. That patience gnawed at Richard. So Richard decided to make things harder. He sidled up to the tool cart, slid one of the smaller sockets just out of place. Subtle, petty, enough to slow Darnell down if he reached for it. The move wasn't about sabotage of the engine. It was about humiliation. But Darnell didn't even flinch. He didn't reach for that socket. He used his flashlight and his eyes like they were instruments sharper than any tool in the shop. Then came the first test. He noticed the faint smell of burned wiring again, stronger now that he was close. He traced it to a cluster of harnesses buried deep near the firewall. One of them looked intact, but something about the way it sagged didn't feel right. He tugged gently. The insulation cracked like old paint. A couple of mechanics gasped. Richard pounced. Careful. You break it, you buy it. Darnell held up the frayed piece of wire for all to see. Already broken, he said simply. The bay went quiet again. Richard's smirk faltered for a half-second. Then he laughed loud and cruel. Oh wow, a broken wire. Somebody give this man a medal. The others laughed with him, but not all. Miguel's eyes lit up. He'd seen that wire cluster earlier and hadn't noticed a thing. Darnell didn't let the mockery distract him. He moved deeper, tracing connections, whispering almost to himself, "If this wire's cooked, then the sensor downstream." He crouched, following the line. His flashlight caught a smear of soot near the intake manifold, a detail so small most eyes would have skimmed past it. He nodded once, confirming something only he could see. Richard, watching, began to pace like a wolf. His audience was slipping, their attention caught by Darnell's quiet confidence. That couldn't happen, not here. Not in his shop. You know what? Richard barked suddenly. Clock's ticking. You've got 10 minutes before I call the tow truck to send this beast to a real specialist. Let's see if your magic ears can beat the clock. The ultimatum hung in the air. Darnell didn't look at him. He just reached for a wrench. Not the one Richard had moved, another. His hands were steady as stone, Miguel whispered. He's not even sweating. Time passed in thick silence, broken only by Richard's exaggerated sighs and the occasional hiss of a pneumatic tool from another bay. Darnell pulled the intake apart with precision, every movement efficient, as though he'd done this exact job 100 times. But he hadn't. This car was foreign, rare, a nightmare of German engineering layered with software that most shops didn't dare touch. Still, Darnell worked with the same calm he'd once used when fixing his mama's beat-up Ford after a night shift at the plant. And then, it happened. The intake came free. And beneath it lay the heart of the problem. A sensor unit, blackened at the edges, cracked down the middle. Darnell stared for a beat, then smiled faintly. Richard, curious despite himself, leaned in. What is it? Darnell lifted the ruined sensor into the light. Your engine wasn't dead. It was suffocating. For a moment, no one spoke. The words hung heavy, laced with certainty. Richard's face tightened. He wanted to laugh it off, but he could feel the tide shifting. The eyes in the room weren't on him anymore. They were on the man with grease-stained hands and a ruined sensor in his palm. You haven't fixed anything yet, Richard snapped, louder than necessary. Don't act like you've won. Darnell just set the broken sensor gently on the tool cart, wiped his hands and said, We'll see. The quiet confidence in those words rattled Richard more than any insult could have. Miguel's voice broke the silence. Do you think he can actually get it running? Nobody answered. Because the truth was, no one had ever seen Richard nervous before, and right then he was. But what Darnell discovered next would push the tension past breaking point. And it wasn't just the car on the line anymore. The cracked sensor sat on the cart like a piece of evidence in a trial, daring anyone to deny what it meant. But Richard wasn't about to let a moment of silence turn into Darnell's victory. He clapped his hands together, loud, sharp, and mocking. Well, congratulations, Sherlock Holmes. You found a broken piece of plastic. What now? Are you going to pray over it and watch the car heal itself? A few uneasy laughs followed, thin and forced. Most of the techs stayed stone-faced. They weren't fools. They knew Darnell had just spotted something that every scan tool in the bay had missed. But none of them were brave enough to admit it out loud. Not with Richard watching. Darnell didn't bite. He didn't even glance at the manager. He pulled open the parts catalog on the service computer, typed in the model, scrolled with quick precision. The replacement sensor wasn't a common part. The nearest warehouse that carried it was 3 cities over. 2-day delivery minimum. Richard saw the hesitation flicker across Darnell's face and pounced. Oh, don't tell me you're stuck already. Guess the miracle worker ran out of miracles. 2 days waiting on a part? That customer out there will love hearing that. Through the glass wall, the showroom glowed in the midday sun. The car's owner, a slick-suited man with a Rolex that caught the light every time he moved, was pacing by the coffee station, phone glued to his ear. Clearly the type of client Richard drooled over. Richard smirked, lowering his voice for effect. You know what kind of man drives a machine like this? A man who doesn't have time for delays. A man who wouldn't trust you to check his tire pressure. The insult landed heavy. A couple of mechanics winced. Miguel shifted, jaw tight but said nothing. Darnell's eyes stayed locked on the computer screen. His fingers drummed once, twice against the desk. Then he exhaled slowly and turned back to the car. The sensors cooked, yeah, he said, voice calm. But that's not the whole story. Something burned it out. Replace it without fixing the cause and the new one dies too. The bay quieted again. Even the younger techs knew he was right. Replacing parts without solving the root issue was a rookie move. Richard hated that the crowd was listening. So he raised the stakes. Fine. You claim you can solve the mystery. Do it, but do it now. No waiting on parts. No excuses. He yanked the hood higher, theatrically. Come on, genius. Prove it. Darnell's lips pressed into a thin line. He grabbed his tools. Not fancy, not digital. Just reliable metal that had been with him through 100 late nights and impossible fixes. As he leaned back into the engine bay, the air around him seemed to shift. He was in his element now. He traced the fried sensor line backward, hands steady. The flashlight beam landed on a cluster of connectors near the throttle body. He pulled one apart. The pins were corroded, green with oxidation. Not enough to kill the car outright, but enough to cause a surge, fry the sensor and choke the engine. Got you, he murmured. But Richard heard. What's that? Another fairy tale? Darnell held up the connector. This corrosion. Fix the wiring, bypass the short, the sensor stops frying. Miguel's eyes widened. He's right, he whispered. Richard shot him a glare that could have frozen fire. Miguel shut up instantly. That's when Richard made his move. He sauntered to the tool cart again, picked up a ratchet and twirled it casually. You sure you don't need a scanner? Might be a little advanced for your listening skills. Darnell ignored him, setting up to clean and splice the corroded wiring. His hands were quick, precise. Muscle memory from years of making do with less than the best. Richard leaned closer, voice low but sharp. You fail here, and it's not just your pride. It's your job. Darnell didn't stop working. You don't sign my checks. Oh, but I sure as hell decide if you get ours, Richard shot back, smirk curling. The words hit heavy. Every mechanic in the bay froze, tools hovering midair. That was the threat everyone feared. Fewer hours meant less pay, meant bills unpaid, kids unfed. Richard had just said it out loud, and Darnell still didn't flinch. As he spliced the wire, his mind drifted. Not away, but back. He was 12 years old again, sitting on the curb outside his mother's house, clutching a busted carburetor in his lap. Kids from the block had laughed at him earlier, said he'd never fix it, said he was wasting his time. His mama had walked out, apron dusted with flour, wiping her hands. She'd crouched down, looked him straight in the eye and said, "Baby, don't let anyone laugh you out of what you know. Dignity isn't in the words people throw at you. It's in what you do with your hands after." He carried that lesson every day since. And right now, with Richard breathing down his neck, it burned like fuel in his chest. He tightened the splice, cleaned the connector, reseated it. Richard barked a laugh. Cute little patch job. Think that's gonna save you? Darnell ignored him again. He reached for the intake assembly, began reattaching it with careful, steady turns. Every bolt snugged down with the quiet click of practiced hands. Then came the moment. He slid into the driver's seat, key in hand. The bay grew still. Even the air compressor seemed to hold its breath. Darnell twisted the ignition. The starter groaned. The engine coughed once, twice, and then caught. A deep, throaty rumble filled the bay. Rough at first, shaky. Then, as the computer adjusted, the idle smoothed. The V-12 purred like a beast waking from a coma. The crowd erupted. Gasps, murmurs, even a whistle. Miguel grinned openly now, pride shining in his eyes. Richard froze. His smirk faltered, replaced with something sharp and cold. But before victory could settle, something shifted. A loud pop cracked under the hood, followed by a hiss of steam. The engine stumbled, choking. Warning lights on the dash flared red. The room gasped. The purr collapsed into a stuttering cough. Richard's grin snapped back into place, wolfish. Well, well, well. Looks like the miracle didn't last. Darnell's hands gripped the steering wheel tight. His eyes narrowed, scanning the gauges, listening to the rhythm of the failing engine. He knew what just happened. And it wasn't random. Someone had messed with it. And when Darnell traced the sabotage, what he uncovered wouldn't just expose Richard's cruelty, it would put the entire shop on the edge of collapse. The engine wheezed, warning lights blazing across the dashboard like a Christmas tree on fire. The hiss of steam coiled into the air, sharp with the smell of coolant. The mechanic scrambled closer, curiosity overriding caution. Miguel leaned in, voice tense. That wasn't the sensor. Darnell killed the ignition, swung out of the driver's seat, and popped the hood again. His eyes moved fast, scanning the compartments. It didn't take long. The coolant cap, usually sealed tight, was barely threaded on. Loosened. Deliberately, his gaze slid across the bay, past the younger techs, past the silent crowd, and landed squarely on Richard. For a split second, Richard's smirk faltered. Then it returned, bigger, nastier. "What's the matter?" he called, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Can't even put a cap on, right? Rookie mistake, huh?" A ripple of laughter broke out, but thinner now, hesitant. Everyone had seen how careful Darnell was. Everyone knew that cap hadn't come off by accident. Darnell's jaw flexed, but he didn't speak. He grabbed a rag, twisted the cap back into place with one smooth turn, and stood tall again. The silence stretched. Richard couldn't help himself. He stepped forward, voice dropping to a venomous whisper only Darnell could hear. "You're done. You think these guys are on your side? They laugh at you behind your back. You'll never be more than grease under my shoes." Darnell turned his head slowly, eyes locking with Richard's. For the first time that morning, he smiled. Small, calm, dangerous, we'll see. Back in the seat, he turned the key again. The V-12 roared, this time stronger, steadier. The gauges leveled, the idle purred. The machine breathed, the bay vibrated with its growl. Miguel let out a low whistle. He did it. Richard's face hardened. He had one card left, humiliation in front of the customer. The showroom door hissed open and the suited owner strode in, impatience dripping from every step. His Rolex flashed as he clapped once. "Well, am I driving home today or not?" Richard plastered on his polished grin, sliding in front of the man before Darnell could speak. "Absolutely, sir. Our top technician here," he gestured vaguely, not naming Darnell, "just finished diagnosing the issue. Everything's back to normal?" The owner narrowed his eyes. "Back to normal? That car cost me more than some people's houses. Don't want normal. I want perfection." Richard laughed too loudly. "Of course. That's exactly what we deliver here." The man's gaze cut past him, straight to Darnell. "And you? You the one who touched my engine?" The bay stilled. Everyone waited. Darnell stepped forward, wiping his hands. His voice was steady. "Yes, sir. Your sensor was fried. Corrosion in the wiring caused it. I repaired the harness and stabilized the system. She'll run. But..." He paused, glancing at Richard before continuing. "Someone tampered with your coolant cap. That's why it sputtered just now." The words dropped like lead. The mechanics froze. Miguel's jaw fell open. The owner blinked, turning sharply toward Richard. "Is that true?" Richard barked a laugh. "What? Of course not. He's covering for his mistakes. You saw the engine sputter, amateur hour. I would never endanger a client's car." But the way his voice cracked on never told another story. The owner's eyes narrowed further. He looked at Darnell, then at the circle of techs. "Which one of you saw what happened?" Silence, thick, dangerous. No one wanted to cross Richard. Miguel's fists clenched. He shifted on his feet. His lips parted, then closed again. "Fear won. For now," Richard smirked, sensing victory. "See, nobody saw anything because nothing happened. This guy's just trying to make excuses. But Darnell didn't back down. He wiped the sweat from his brow, stepped closer to the car, and said, clear enough for everyone to hear, engines don't lie. People do. The words hit the room like thunder. The owner studied him. Then slowly he moved toward the car, sliding into the driver's seat himself. He twisted the key. The V12 rumbled alive again, smooth this time, no stutter, no hiss. He revved it once. The sound shook the bay, clean and powerful. His head tilted, impressed despite himself. He climbed back out, adjusting his cufflinks. Drives like new, he said flatly. Richard's grin returned, quick as lightning. Of course. That's the level of service we pride ourselves on. The owner cut him off with a raised hand. His gaze locked on Darnell. What's your name? Darnell hesitated. Darnell Brooks, sir. The owner nodded once. I like men who fix problems instead of running their mouths. You got a card? Darnell blinked. I work here. The man glanced at Richard, then back at Darnell. Shame. You should run your own place. He turned, striding back to the showroom, tossing one last line over his shoulder. Send me the bill. Make sure he gets the credit. The door hissed shut behind him. The bay was silent, the kind of silence that weighs heavy on lungs. Richard's face was scarlet, his jaw locked. His eyes darted around the circle of mechanics, daring one of them to laugh, to speak. To breathe, nobody did. Darnell just stood there, calm as stone, the engine still humming behind him like proof of everything he was. For the first time, Richard looked small, but Richard Kane wasn't the kind of man to let humiliation end quietly, and his next move would drag the entire shop into chaos. The air in the garage was heavy, almost electric. Every mechanic, every tool, every speck of grease seemed to pause in anticipation. Darnell's hands, steady as stone, gave one last twist on the fuel line. He wiped his palms on his coveralls, exhaled through his nose, and nodded toward the ignition. Try it now, he said, his voice low but resonant. The young apprentice at the driver's seat hesitated. His eyes darted to Richard, who stood with arms crossed, lips curled in a smug sneer, as if daring the engine to stay dead. But the boy glanced back at Darnell, caught the calm certainty in his eyes, and turned the key. The garage exploded. The engine roared to life like a beast awakened from slumber. Not a sputter, not a weak cough. A clean, powerful rumble that rolled through the workshop and vibrated the concrete floor beneath their boots. It was the sound of mastery, the sound of impossible problems solved. Every head snapped toward the car. Eyes widened. A socket wrench clattered to the floor in the far corner, the mechanic holding it staring with his mouth hanging open. Someone whispered, almost reverently, "It runs." The smell of burnt oil and gasoline mixed with the sharp, clean hum of combustion. The vibrations rattled the thin metal cabinets and made the fluorescent lights overhead tremble. For a long, surreal moment, no one moved. Silence breaks. Then the silence shattered with a single voice. Richard. "Well," he barked, clapping once, the sound sharp and false. "About damn time somebody figured it out. Took you long enough, Darnell." He strode toward the car as if it had been his idea all along. His polished shoes clicked across the oil-stained floor, his cologne pushing against the honest smell of sweat and diesel. He gestured grandly toward the rumbling engine, addressing the stunned mechanics like a salesman at a trade show. "See, gentlemen? That's why I put him on it. I knew he'd eventually get it working." But no one clapped. No one cheered. The shop's air shifted. Everyone had heard his laughter hours earlier. Everyone had heard his words, sharp, cruel, and poisoned with that same smug superiority he was trying to mask now. And worse, they'd all seen Darnell's face when Richard had spat those words at him. Darnell speaks. Darnell walked slowly around the car, wiping grease from his fingertips with a rag. His eyes weren't on the engine. They weren't even on the staff. They were locked squarely on Richard. His voice was calm, but it carried, cutting through the thick hum of the motor like a blade. "You laughed at me, Richard." The words landed heavy. The apprentice at the wheel froze. A mechanic nearby stopped pretending to adjust his tools and turned fully to listen. Richard forced a laugh, thin and brittle. Now, don't get all sensitive. It's just shop talk." Darnell's jaw tightened. His rag twisted in his hand. He didn't raise his voice, but his words held a gravity that pressed on every chest in the room. You didn't laugh at the problem. You laughed at me. You called me boy in front of everyone here. The room's temperature dropped. Even the engine's steady purr seemed to quiet, as though the machine itself understood the weight of what was being said. The staff reacts a cough from the back. A mechanic named Luis muttered under his breath, but loud enough for others to catch. He did. We all heard it. Heads nodded slowly, cautiously at first. The silence wasn't silence anymore. It was agreement shared through glances and half-whispered words. Richard's carefully polished authority, built on fear and fake charm, was cracking. Richard's smile faltered. He adjusted his tie, pointless in this grease-soaked place, and sneered. Let's not make this about race. You people always— He stopped himself too late. The phrase hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. You people, Darnell's dignity. Darnell didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He stepped forward, close enough that Richard had to tilt his chin up slightly to meet his gaze. I fixed what you called impossible. Not because of you. In spite of you. His words were steady, deliberate. He gestured toward the engine with the rag still in his hand. This car runs because I know my craft. Because I don't quit when a job gets hard. Because I respect the work, even when the people around me don't respect me. No one moved. No one dared interrupt. And if you think calling me boy will make me smaller, you're wrong. I stand on the shoulders of people who worked with half the tools I have, under twice the hate, and they still built something that lasted. I don't shrink. Not for you. Not for anyone. The rag dropped to the floor with a soft thud. Richard's face went red, then pale, then red again. He spun to the mechanics, desperate for backup. Are you just gonna stand there? He's out of line. But no one spoke. Luis folded his arms. The apprentice's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, but his eyes stayed locked on Darnell with quiet admiration. Another mechanic, a tall woman named Carla, shook her head slowly. He's not out of line, she said. You are. The words hit Richard harder than a fist. The corporate step-in, and then came the final blow. The side door creaked open. Heavy footsteps echoed across the garage floor. The murmurs died instantly. It was the regional director, a broad-shouldered man in a gray suit, silver hair slicked back, clipboard in hand. He had been scheduled for an inspection next week, but here he was now, having arrived quietly in the middle of the chaos. No one knew how much he had heard, but the look in his eyes said, enough. The director surveyed the running engine. Then the silent crowd. Then Richard, whose polished composure had dissolved into sweat and panic. Finally, he looked at Darnell. You fixed this? Darnell nodded once. Yes, sir. The director's lips pressed into a thin line, not anger, but something weightier. Turn it off, he said. The apprentice killed the ignition. The engine clicked into silence. All that remained was the ragged sound of Richard's breathing. The director closed his clipboard with a snap. Richard, he said evenly. My office now, Richard stammered. But sir, now, the word cut like steel. Richard flinched. For the first time, he looked small. The director turned back to Darnell. His tone softened just slightly. You stay here. I'll need to speak with you after. And then he walked out, Richard scurrying behind him, his shoes slipping on the oil-slick floor. The door slammed shut. The garage was silent again. The mechanics slowly drifted back to their stations, but their eyes lingered on Darnell. Respect, quiet, unspoken respect. Darnell picked up the rag from the floor, folded it neatly and tucked it into his pocket. His hands shook just slightly, but his voice was steady when he said to no one in particular, back to work. The hum of tools started up again, but lighter, freer somehow. Still, the question hung in the air. What would happen behind that office door? The sound of the office door slamming still echoed in the garage when the shop slowly came back to life. Wrenches clinked, air compressors hissed, and conversations started again in low, cautious voices. But beneath the surface, everyone knew the storm wasn't over. Richard was behind that office door with the regional director, and the fate of the entire workshop seemed to hang on what was happening in there. Darnell leaned against the fender of the now silent car. His chest rose and fell with slow, controlled breaths. He wasn't celebrating, not yet. He'd been in enough battles to know that victory wasn't always as clean as turning the key on an engine. Richard stood stiff-backed in front of the director's desk, sweat gathering at his temples despite the humming air conditioner. His voice was pitched higher than usual, thin with panic. "Sir, I think this whole thing's being blown out of proportion. You know how shop talk can be? These men, well, they're sensitive these days. You can't say anything without someone twisting your words." The director didn't look up. He was flipping through a file, his expression unreadable. "Richard," he said flatly, "do you remember why you were given this branch to manage?" Richard licked his lips. "Because of my record. Because I know how to drive numbers. Customer satisfaction, revenue, growth. No." The director's eyes snapped up, pinning him in place. "Because I trusted you. Because this shop needed discipline. What I didn't give you was permission to humiliate your staff. And I sure as hell didn't give you permission to drag this company into racial scandal." Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He tried a weak laugh. "Come on, it was a joke. A harmless, call the grown man boy in front of witnesses." The director cut in. "That's not harmless. That's not a joke. That's poison." Richard's composure cracked. His hands trembled as he clutched the edge of the desk. "You can't take his side over mine. I've been running this shop for years. He's just a mechanic." The director's voice went cold. "He's the mechanic who fixed what you told me was unsalvageable. While you wasted your breath tearing him down." The office door opened. A young assistant poked his head out. "Darnell, the director wants to see you." The garage went quiet again. Every mechanic glanced up. Darnell straightened, patted the grease from his hands one last time, and walked slowly toward the office. Inside, Richard glared daggers at him from the corner of the room, his tie loosened, his polish crumbling. The director gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. "Sit." Darnell did. He didn't slouch, didn't fold into himself. He sat tall, back straight, eyes forward. The director studied him for a moment, then said, "Tell me, in your own words, what happened out there." Darnell inhaled deeply. "I was assigned to the car. It was called impossible. I stayed with it, found the fault, and repaired it. And the rest?" The director pressed. Darnell's gaze flickered toward Richard, then back to the director. His voice stayed level. He laughed. "He called me boy more than once. In front of everyone." The director nodded slowly. "Anything else you want to add?" Darnell shook his head. "No, sir. The work speaks for itself." Richard's unraveling. Richard exploded. "This is insane," he shouted, stepping forward. "You're really going to take his word over mine? He's making it about race because that's what they do. He's trying to paint me as some kind of monster just because I demanded results." The director didn't move. "I didn't hear him raise his voice once." "But I heard you," Richard faltered. His fists clenched at his sides. His voice cracked with desperation. "You need me, sir. I keep this place running. You take me out, it all falls apart." The director leaned back, his eyes cold and sharp as glass. "The only thing falling apart is you." The director's verdict came like a gavel. "Richard, you're suspended, effective immediately. HR will handle the paperwork. I'll decide within the week whether that suspension becomes permanent termination." Richard staggered back, like he'd been struck. "Suspended? You can't." "I can." The director cut him off. "And I just did." Richard's voice shriveled into a whisper. "This isn't over." The director's glare silenced him. "For you, it is." Richard stormed out, his footsteps echoing down the hall like a retreating drumbeat. The mechanics in the garage turned to watch as he shoved through the exit door, slamming it behind him. The director stepped out of the office a moment later with Darnell at his side. He cleared his throat. "Listen up." The shop went quiet again. "I want every one of you to know something. What I saw today wasn't just a car being fixed. It was a man doing his job with skill, with patience, and with dignity. That matters. More than numbers, more than image, more than any of the nonsense you've been dealing with." His hand rested briefly on Darnell's shoulder. "This shop doesn't run without men like him. And from now on, I expect respect to flow both ways. Anyone who has a problem with that can find another garage to work in." The mechanics nodded. A few murmured their agreement. Carla clapped once, then Luis, then the apprentice. The sound built into genuine applause, the kind that echoed with relief and solidarity. Darnell didn't smile. He didn't bow his head. He simply stood, absorbing the moment, knowing what it meant. That night, long after the garage had emptied, Darnell stayed behind. He sat on the hood of the now silent car, the smell of oil and steel still clinging to the air. He thought of his mother's words, spoken decades earlier in a kitchen where the wallpaper peeled and the lights flickered. They'll try to make you small. But you don't have to be. Stand tall, son. Even if your knees shake. His knees had shaken that day, but he hadn't bent. And in not bending, he'd done more than fix an engine. He'd fixed a crack in his own spirit that had been waiting for years to be tested. Final audience question. What would you have done in Darnell's place? Would you have stayed silent, swallowed the insult just to keep your job? Or would you have stood tall, even if it meant risking everything? Share this if you believe respect should never be optional.